At 4:15 on a Saturday afternoon, I pulled up to the Rosewood Country Club in a rented silver Nissan Altima that still smelled like stale coffee and lemon cleaner from the agency on Route 9. The valet looked at my car first. That told me everything I needed to know. Around me, guests stepped out of black Escalades, Bentleys, and one white Rolls-Royce with flowers tied to the mirrors like the vehicle itself had gotten engaged. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed too loud near the fountain entrance, while women in pale pink dresses balanced champagne glasses before the ceremony had even started. Somebody hired a live string quartet to play outside in 92-degree heat, and those poor musicians looked one violin stroke away from passing out. My sister Chloe always did believe suffering was acceptable if it looked expensive enough. I adjusted the collar on my navy dress whites and checked the gold captains bars one more time before getting out of the car. The humidity hit me immediately. South Carolina in July felt like walking into C. Elsa's wet laundry. I reached back into the passenger seat and picked up the wedding gift. A small white box with a silver ribbon. Inside was a vintage Cartier clock I'd spent 5 weeks debating whether I could afford. $4,217.83 after taxes and restoration fees. I bought it anyway because Chloe once pointed at that exact model during a shopping trip in Annapolis 3 years earlier and said, "One day, my husband better love me enough to buy me something like that." At the time, she'd laughed. I hadn't. That was probably my first mistake. The glass pavilion behind the country club shimmered under the late afternoon sun like a luxury car dealership. White roses climbed across enormous gold arches, while workers rushed around carrying crystal trays and floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance. Everything looked soft. Soft pink. Soft lighting. Soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers. The kind of wedding designed for people who described water as curated. I started toward the main entrance when a woman with a clipboard suddenly appeared in front of me so fast I almost thought I'd broken some security perimeter. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, already sweating through her blazer. "Captain Sterling, that's usually how introductions work." "Yes." She gave a nervous little laugh that died almost immediately. "I'm Denise, wedding coordinator. Your mother asked me to catch you before you entered through the front." There it was. Didn't even take 30 seconds. I kept my expression neutral. Years in military intelligence teaches you how to look calm while internally writing a 12-page threat assessment. "She did?" Denise nodded carefully like she was approaching a nervous dog. "She's just concerned about visual consistency for the bridal photography." Visual consistency? Yes. The military uniform was apparently. She swallowed. A little too stark against the blush and champagne color palette. I stared at her for about 3 seconds. Not because I was shocked. Because I was honestly impressed my mother had found a way to turn patriotism into a decorating issue. Denise shifted awkwardly and pointed toward a narrow brick walkway beside the building. "If you could just use the service entrance for now, they're finishing family portraits near the main staircase." Family portraits. Interesting choice of words considering I apparently wasn't invited to be visible in them. I almost laughed. Instead, I thanked her because she looked exhausted and underpaid, and none of this was her fault. The service hallway smelled like butter, bleach, and industrial coffee. Kitchen staff rushed past carrying trays of roasted sea bass, while 2 teenage busboys argued about football near a rack of champagne glasses. Nobody looked twice at me back there. Honestly, it felt more comfortable than the front entrance. At least the kitchen staff weren't pretending. One of the cooks glanced at my uniform and nodded once. "Thank you for your service, Mom." Simple, quiet, real. That one sentence carried more respect than anything my family had given me in years. I followed the hallway toward the ballroom entrance while hearing pieces of the wedding through the walls. Laughter. Glasses clinking. Somebody yelling for extra ice. A photographer directing people around like he was evacuating civilians from a burning building. Closer together. Pretend you actually like each other. Beautiful, beautiful. The last one sounded medically impossible. I stopped a side doorway and caught sight of my mother across the ballroom. Evelyn Sterling looked exactly the way wealthy divorce attorneys hope their clients will look after the settlement clears. Perfect blonde waves. Ivory designer gown. Diamond earrings that probably required insurance paperwork. She was smiling at guests with that polished country club warmth she reserved for rich people and magazine photographers. Then her eyes landed on me. The smile disappeared for half a second. Not sadness, not guilt, Just irritation. Like someone had noticed a stain she thought housekeeping already removed. She crossed the room quickly, heels clicking against marble. "Sarah," she said under her breath. "Why are you standing there?" I entered the building. "Not through the main entrance, I hope." I looked directly at her, no mother. Apparently I'm a threat to pastel colors. She closed her eyes briefly, like I was the difficult one. "Please don't start today." "That depends. Are we pretending I'm family today or staff?" Her jaw tightened. "You know how important appearances are for this event. Preston's family invited senators, investors, board members, and God forbid they see a military officer before dinner." "That's not what I said." "No. You hired someone else to say it for you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. A server carrying champagne squeezed awkwardly between us while my mother stepped aside without breaking eye contact. Then she noticed the wrapped gift in my hand. "Oh, good," she said quickly. "At least you brought something respectable." That one almost got me, not the insult itself, the casualness of it. Like reducing your daughter to an inconvenience was just normal conversation before cocktail hour. I looked past her toward the ballroom where Chloe stood near the giant floral display, laughing with bridesmaids in matching satin dresses. She looked happy, beautiful, honestly, untouchable in the way wealthy people often do when they've spent their entire lives protected from consequences. And for one stupid second, I still hoped maybe she'd see me and smile. She didn't. A bridesmaid whispered something into her ear instead, and all 5 of them glanced toward my uniform before quickly looking away. I suddenly became very interested in the ice sculpture shaped like swans. Have you ever shown up for the people you loved, only to realize they were embarrassed to be seen standing next to you? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe respect matters more than status, subscribe to the channel because this night only got worse from there. I kept staring at that stupid ice sculpture for another few seconds because it felt safer than looking at my family. Then I picked up my gift box again and walked deeper into the ballroom before anyone else could decide where I was allowed to stand. The reception hall looked like somebody had handed a billionaire a Pinterest account and an unlimited budget. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft amber lighting across 200 perfectly folded napkins, while waiters floated between tables carrying champagne that probably cost more per bottle than my first car. A jazz trio played near the dance floor. Nobody listened to them. Rich people never really listen to live music. They rent it the same way they rent flowers in valet parking, just another expensive object proving they can afford atmosphere. I found my seat assignment near the entrance display, table 18, of course. Every important guest sat near the dance floor under the main lighting. Tables 1 through 8 surrounded the bridal stage like a small kingdom orbiting its rulers. Politicians, hedge fund managers, old money families, and people whose teeth looked aggressively insured laughed over imported wine while photographers moved around them like wildlife documentarians filming rare species. Table 18 sat in the far back corner beside the swinging kitchen doors. Every 30 seconds, those doors burst open with heat, noise, and the smell of garlic butter. Buzzboys rushed through carrying stacks of dirty plates while cooks yelled timings behind the wall. Honestly, I'd had quieter meals inside aircraft carriers. I pulled out my chair and sat down beside a fake ficus tree that was probably hiding an electrical outlet. At least my table mates looked normal. A middle-aged cousin I barely recognized. An elderly woman named Donna who immediately stole 2 bread rolls and hid them inside her purse like a trained professional. Some quiet guy from Preston's accounting firm who looked terrified of accidentally touching the wrong fork. Nobody bothered me. That part was almost relaxing. A waiter appeared beside me with practiced politeness. "Still or sparkling water, Mom? Whichever one's free." He snorted before catching himself. "Still it is." There it was again. Tiny moments with strangers that felt more human than conversations with my own relatives. I loosened my shoulders slightly and looked around the ballroom while servers delivered filet mignon and lobster tails under giant hanging flower arrangements. Somebody near the front had ordered custom ice cubes with Chloe and Preston's initials frozen inside them. Nothing says eternal love like branded beverages. Across the room, my mother moved from table to table with terrifying efficiency. Evelyn Sterling didn't walk through crowds. She managed them. I watched her touch people lightly on the elbow while introducing Chloe like she'd personally invented her. She's always been extraordinary. Preston absolutely adores her. They're already looking at properties in the Hamptons. Every sentence sounded rehearsed enough for investor meetings, and every time somebody's eyes drifted toward me in the back corner, my mother smoothly redirected the conversation somewhere else before my existence complicated the aesthetic. At one point, I actually watched her physically turn a man's shoulders away from my table mid-conversation. That took talent. The kitchen doors slammed open beside me as two busboys carried out trays stacked with half-eaten steaks. One of them looked about 19. He glanced at my uniform. "Mom, were you really in the Navy?" "Still am." His eyes widened a little. "That's cool as hell." Then he disappeared back into the kitchen before I could answer. Meanwhile, somewhere near table 3, a venture capitalist was explaining cryptocurrency to a state senator with the confidence of a man who'd absolutely panicked during a tire change. America is a fascinating place. About 20 minutes into dinner, I heard someone call my name. Not Sarah. Sar Bear. Only one person still called me that. I looked, saw Uncle Richard weaving between tables with a whiskey glass in one hand and his tie already loosened. My father's older brother. Real estate money. Loud laugh. Permanent smell of cedar cigars. Honestly, he was probably the only person in this family who ever treated me like I existed outside holiday photos. "There she is," he said, smiling warmly. "Jesus Christ, kid, look at you." I stood up enough to hug him carefully around the shoulders. "You're drunk already? It's an open bar and I have 3 ex-wives. Show some respect. Fair point." He pulled back and looked at my uniform with genuine curiosity. "So where have they got you stationed these days?" "Chloe said you've been overseas a lot." A couple people nearby glanced over. Not because they cared. Because military stories are entertainment to wealthy people as long as nobody gets too honest. I opened my mouth to answer when another voice slid smoothly into the conversation. "Oh, Sarah's work sounds way more dramatic than it actually is, Chloe." Of course. She appeared beside Uncle Richard in a fitted white reception gown, covered in tiny crystals that caught the light every time she moved. Up close, she smelled like expensive perfume and champagne. Beautiful, carefully engineered, dangerous in the way smiling people sometimes are. She rested one manicured hand lightly against Uncle Richard's arm. "She mostly does glorified paperwork for the government," Chloe said with a playful little laugh. "A lot of classified emails and spreadsheets because apparently she couldn't figure out a real corporate career path." A few people around us chuckled politely, not hard enough to seem cruel, just enough to let me know they agreed. I looked directly at my sister. Same blue eyes as mine. Different universe behind them. Uncle Richard frowned slightly. "I thought she was deployed near Syria last year." Chloe waved her hand dismissively. "Well, technically. But Eris always makes things sound very Jason Desenborn when it's probably mostly meetings and printer problems." More laughter. Soft this time. Comfortable. The kind of laugh people make when they know they're standing near money and want to stay invited to things. I could have corrected her. Could have explained that 11 months ago I spent 36 straight hours routing emergencies extraction intel while 2 wounded operators bled inside a collapsing safe zone outside Al-Hasaka. Could have mentioned the part where one wrong coordinate would have sent a Black Hawk directly into hostile fire. Could have explained why I still woke up some nights hearing rotor blades in my head at 2:17 in the morning. Instead, I picked up my water glass calmly. "Yeah," I said. "Mostly printer problems." Chloe smiled all proudly like she'd successfully managed an awkward situation. Then she leaned closer toward me. "You don't mind, right?" she whispered softly enough that only I could hear. "Tonight just isn't really about military stuff. Not military stuff." I looked around the ballroom again, at the gold decorations, the investment bankers, the imported flowers, the people measuring each other's net worth through wristwatches and zip codes. Their currency was status. And sitting at table 18, beside the kitchen doors, I finally understood something that should have hit me years ago. To these people, sacrifice meant nothing unless it came with valet parking. I took another sip of water because it was either that or say something that would get replayed at family holidays for the next 20 years. Chloe gave my shoulder a quick little pat like she'd just handled an embarrassing public relations issue, then floated back toward the center of the ballroom where the important people were sitting. That was the thing about my sister. She never walked away from conversations. She exited scenes. The waitstaff cleared dinner plates around the room while guests migrated toward the dance floor and dessert stations. Somebody rolled out a 7-tier wedding cake that looked less edible and more legally protected by historic preservation laws. By 7:30, the ballroom lighting dimmed slightly, and the wedding planner tapped her champagne glass near the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention for the evening toasts. A soft wave of applause moved through the room. I stayed seated at table 18 beside the kitchen doors, while everyone else turned toward the center stage under the chandeliers. The jazz trio stopped playing, and for the first time all evening, the ballroom actually became quiet. Preston stepped onto the stage first, tall, perfect tuxedo, hair that looked genetically approved by private equity firms. He wrapped one arm around Chloe's waist while accepting the microphone, and the crowd immediately melted into that strange rich people reaction where everyone smiles like they're auditioning to become future grandparents. I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight, Preston said smoothly. Seriously, seeing friends and family travel from Manhattan, London, Paris, and Palm Beach just to celebrate with us means everything. There were approving murmurs across the ballroom. Of course there were. These people treated frequent flyer miles like military medals. Preston continued thanking investors, business partners, golf buddies, and somebody named Chip, whose entire personality appeared to be owning a yacht. Then Chloe took the microphone. The room loved her instantly. My sister had always known how to perform warmth in front of crowds. It was honestly impressive to watch if you ignored the emotional casualties behind it. She smiled under the soft lighting, while her wedding dress sparkled against the stage. I know everyone says this, Chloe began, but this really is the most perfect night of my life. More applause. A bridesmaid near the front actually wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Donna from my table quietly stole 3 miniature desserts into her purse without breaking eye contact with the stage. Honestly, she remained my favorite person there. Chloe continued talking about soulmates, destiny, and how she knew Preston was the one because he understood her love language was apparently luxury real estate. The crowd laughed on command. Then came the family section of the speech. I knew it was coming because my stomach tightened the same way it used to before difficult briefings overseas. Not fear exactly, more like instinct. My mother has been absolutely incredible through this entire process, Chloe said emotionally. Everything you see tonight happened because of her vision. My mother dabbed carefully at the corner of one eye while guests applauded politely. Vision. Interesting word for psychological dictatorship. And obviously, Chloe continued, I have to thank my big sister Sarah for being here tonight. A few heads turned toward the back corner, toward me, toward the white navy uniform standing out against a ballroom filled with black tuxedos and champagne-colored dresses. I sat still. Chloe's eyes finally landed directly on me across the room. Then she smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly either. Worse, condescending amusement. Like she was indulging a child who still believed professional wrestling was real. You know, she said into the microphone, I think it's honestly adorable that Sarah still plays soldier after all these years. The room responded with scattered chuckles, small at first, testing the social temperature. Chloe tilted her head slightly while looking at my uniform. I mean, seriously, she actually wore the full costume tonight. Medals and everything. At a black tie wedding, more laughter this time, louder, still controlled enough for wealthy people to pretend they weren't being rude. I felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward me. 300 people silently measuring whether I looked embarrassed yet. I kept my expression neutral. Military training helps with that. So does growing up in the Sterling family. Chloe laughed softly into the microphone, like we were all sharing one giant inside joke together. She used to make us salute her at the dinner table. When we were kids, she added, which explains why she never learned how normal people act. That got a bigger reaction. Several people laughed openly now. One older man near the front almost spit out his wine. And then Preston leaned toward the microphone. That part mattered later. Because unlike Chloe, who weaponized humiliation casually, Preston made a choice. He looked directly toward my table with a relaxed grin and said, Hey, at least somebody's guarding the buffet tonight. The ballroom exploded, not outrage. Laughter, immediate, comfortable. The kind of laughter people release when someone wealthy gives them permission to be cruel. Even some of the wait staff froze awkwardly. A woman at table 6 muttered, Oh, my God, under her breath while still smiling into her champagne glass, because apparently basic human decency becomes complicated around billionaires. The joke hung in the air for a second too long. Guarding the buffet, 15 years, multiple deployments. classified operations, missing birthdays, funerals, holidays. Watching 19-year-olds make adult decisions with shaking hands in combat side zones, holding together terrified analysts during live extractions while people screamed through encrypted headsets at 3 in the morning, reduced to guarding shrimp cocktails for rich strangers. I heard someone near the front whisper, "That's brutal." Then another laugh followed, and another. The sound bounced around the ballroom unevenly before fading into awkward silence. Because even privileged people eventually recognize when something ugly just happened. Preston smiled tightly, like he suddenly realized he'd stepped half an inch too far, but didn't know how to recover. Chloe tried to smooth it over immediately. "Oh, relax. Sarah can take a joke," she said into the microphone. That line almost hurt more than the joke itself, because she genuinely believed it. My entire family had spent years treating my silence like permission. I looked down at my untouched dessert plate while somebody on stage nervously clinked a champagne glass. The kitchen doors swung open behind me again. Dishes crashed somewhere in the back. And for one strange second, that noisy kitchen sounded more honest than the ballroom full of people pretending humiliation counted as entertainment. I slowly folded my napkin once across my lap. Then again, perfect corners, steady hands. Across the room, my mother avoided looking at me entirely. That told me everything. Not one person at the head table thought the problem was the insult. The problem was whether I'd make the evening uncomfortable by reacting to it. I kept folding the napkin because it gave my hands something precise to do besides shake. One corner over the other. Straight edges, perfect square. It was muscle memory at that point. The military trains you to control small things first. Your posture, your breathing, your voice. Tiny pieces of order that stop larger things from falling apart when pressure hits. Across the ballroom, somebody restarted the music too early. A piano version of At Last drifted awkwardly through the silence while guests shifted in their seats, pretending the last 60 seconds hadn't happened. Classic wealthy person survival strategy. If something uncomfortable occurs, simply continue eating expensive cake until reality leaves on its own. I placed the folded napkin beside my plate and looked up slowly. Nobody at the head table met my eyes. Not Chloe, not Preston, not my mother. That part mattered more than the joke. Humiliation is one thing. Cowardice afterward tells you who people really are. A waiter approached carefully with a bottle of wine. "Another glass, Mom?" I almost said yes. Honestly, a strong drink in a locked hotel room sounded fantastic around that point. Instead, I shook my head. "Thanks." He nodded once, relieved I wasn't about to create a scene. That was the funny part. Everybody in that ballroom expected me to explode eventually. They were waiting for it. The difficult military daughter embarrassing the family in front of donors and CEOs. The emotionally unstable woman in uniform, proving she didn't belong among civilized people. Meanwhile, the actual civilized people had just publicly mocked someone's military service between lobster courses. America really does have branding issues. I leaned back slightly in my chair and studied the ballroom from the shadows near the kitchen doors. The chandeliers overhead glittered against polished marble floors, while servers cleared dessert plates with mechanical precision. Gold candlelight reflected off crystal glasses. Women in designer gowns laughed softly beside men discussing private equity mergers, like they were planning a fantasy football draft. Everything looked beautiful, carefully beautiful. And suddenly I felt very far away from it, not emotionally, physically. Like my body remembered different rooms, different sounds, different stakes. 11 months earlier, I'd been sitting inside a temporary operations center outside Al-Hasaka wearing sweat-soaked fatigues and noise-canceling comms while a sandstorm ripped across northern Syria, hard enough to shake the metal walls around us. The air smelled like diesel fuel and overheated electronics. 3 monitors in front of me tracked a compromised extraction route while operators shouted updated coordinates across overlapping radio channels. One convoy had already gone dark. Another vehicle lost mobility near the eastern corridor. 22 personnel stranded inside hostile territory, while 2 separate militant groups closed in from opposite directions. Nobody in that room cared about aesthetics. Nobody cared whose outfit matched the table settings. The only thing that mattered was getting people home alive. I still remembered the sound of the Black Hawk rotors approaching through the storm after midnight. Deep, violent, close enough to rattle your ribs when the pilots finally committed to the emergency extraction route I approved. One wrong call from me that night and families back home would receive folded flags instead of phone calls. I was 31 years old making decisions that affected 22 human lives in real time while surviving on caffeine, adrenaline, and whatever emotional stability remained after 30 straight hours awake. And somehow that responsibility still felt lighter than sitting inside this ballroom. That realization hit me harder than Chloe's joke ever could. Because the people mocking me tonight had absolutely no idea what real pressure looked like. None. Preston panicked earlier because the florist delivered the wrong shade of cream roses. I once watched 19-year-old communications specialist hold pressure on his friend's leg wound while calmly relaying extraction coordinates through tears. Different planets. At the front of the ballroom, Chloe resumed smiling for photographs near the cake table while guests gathered around her again like nothing happened. And honestly, part of me understood it. That was the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all my anger. Most people aren't cruel because they wake up wanting to hurt someone. They're cruel because they've built entire lives insulated from consequences. Their problems stay small enough that status becomes survival. Who got invited? Who sat where? Who looked important? Who sounded successful at dinner parties? That world was all they knew. Meanwhile, I'd spent 15 years inside environments where titles stopped mattering the second bullets started flying, or helicopters lost fuel or intel came in wrong. Out there, leadership wasn't branding. It was burden. It was signing paperwork that sent exhausted operators back into danger because nobody else could complete the mission. It was calling parents after casualties. It was lying awake in temporary housing at 3:11 in the morning, replaying decisions nobody else even knew you made. And the strangest part? You never get to explain any of it. Classified work means carrying entire sections of your life silently while people assume the silence means nothing important happened. That's why Chloe's comment landed where it did. Not because it embarrassed me, because she genuinely believed it. Glorified paperwork. I almost smiled thinking about that phrase. Somewhere in Virginia, 3 separate intelligence officers would probably choke on their coffee hearing that description. A loud burst of laughter erupted from the front tables as Preston started telling another story near the bar. My mother finally glanced toward me for half a second. I held her gaze calmly, no anger, no tears. And I think that unsettled her more. Because she still expected the younger version of me. The girl desperate for approval. The daughter willing to shrink herself just to stay included. That version was gone. Not because the military made me tougher. Because eventually you reach an age where surviving real things changes your relationship with fake ones. I looked around the ballroom one more time, at the chandeliers, the polished smiles, the comfortable people laughing inside a world protected by men and women they barely respected. Then I straightened the sleeve on my dress whites carefully and sat there in complete silence. And for the first time all evening, I realized my silence wasn't weakness. It was armor they didn't know how to penetrate. I adjusted the cuff on my sleeve, slowly, because it was easier than continuing to study the people in that room. The reception recovered fast after the speech. Too fast. Within 15 minutes, guests were drinking again, waiters were circulating fresh trays of espresso martinis, and somebody near the dance floor had started aggressively requesting 80s music from the band like civilization itself depended on hearing Sweet Caroline. Apparently, public humiliation had a very short shelf life when crab cakes were involved. I stayed at table 18, not because I wanted to, because leaving right after the speeches would have given Chloe exactly what she expected. The emotional military sister storming off dramatically while rich people exchanged uncomfortable looks over dessert spoons. No thanks. I'd rather sit beside the kitchen doors and listen to dishwashers commit war crimes against cookware. At least the kitchen was honest. By 8:10, the ballroom had shifted into full reception mode. The older guests migrated toward the bar, while younger couples crowded the dance floor under dim amber lighting. Somebody's drunk uncle was already attempting jazz hands near the stage with the confidence of a man who hadn't stretched since the Clinton administration. Preston stood near a group of investors, laughing loudly with one hand wrapped around a glass of Macallan 18. Chloe floated between conversations collecting compliments like campaign donations. And my mother? She monitored the entire room the way air traffic controllers monitor incoming storms. Every detail mattered to her, every social interaction, every photograph, every perception. At one point, I watched her quietly reposition a centerpiece by maybe half an inch. That level of commitment to appearances should qualify as a medical condition. I checked my watch, 8:14 p.m. That was when I felt it. At first, it barely registered. A low vibration under the hardwood floor, subtle, rhythmic. Then came the sound. Deep diesel engines idling somewhere outside the country club walls. Not one vehicle, multiple. Heavy. Synchronized enough that the crystal glasses on nearby tables gave the faintest little rattle. Several guests paused mid-conversation. The jazz band faltered briefly before continuing. Across the room, Preston frowned toward the rear entrance. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. One of his groomsmen laughed, probably catering trucks. Preston took another drink and rolled his eyes. Perfect. Nothing says elegance like diesel fumes during first dance hour. But the sound didn't fade. It got closer. The engines idled with a strange controlled patience that instantly pulled at something in the back of my mind. Not panic exactly. Recognition. I'd spent too many years around military staging areas not to notice disciplined movement when I heard it. The conversations around the ballroom slowly thinned out. Guests began glancing toward the back oak doors near the service corridor. Even the waitstaff seemed distracted now. Then the vibration stopped. Completely. No engines, no movement. Just silence. The kind that arrives a half second before something changes. One of the violinists lowered her bow uncertainly, and suddenly the massive oak doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open hard enough to interrupt the music mid-measure. The entire room turned. At first, all I saw was white. Dress uniforms. Then details started locking into place one after another. Polished black shoes, gold buttons, broad shoulders, military posture. 20 men stood in the doorway in immaculate navy dress uniforms, their white jackets almost glowing against the darker hallway behind them. And on each chest sat the gold naval special warfare insignia, the trident. Every conversation in the ballroom died instantly. No music, no silverware clinking, nothing. Just 300 wealthy guests staring toward the entrance with the same expression people. Where when reality suddenly walks into a carefully controlled fantasy. The seals stood perfectly still. Not aggressive, not theatrical. That actually made it more intimidating. Real professionals never need to announce themselves. One of the younger bridesmaids whispered, "Oh my God." A waiter beside me quietly muttered, "Holy shit," under his breath before immediately pretending he hadn't spoken. At the front tables, confusion spread fast. Preston straightened uncomfortably. My mother looked horrified. Not scared exactly, socially horrified. Like 20 armed IRS agents had entered carrying bad lighting and unscripted consequences, and then I saw him. Master Chief Marcus Thorne stepped through the center of the formation with the calm confidence of someone completely uninterested in impressing civilians. 45 maybe, tall, weathered face, sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I knew that walk. I'd seen it in briefing rooms, extraction zones, and secure operations centers all over the world. Men like Marcus didn't waste movement. He scanned the ballroom once, quick, professional, and the second his eyes landed on me near the kitchen doors, his entire posture shifted slightly. Recognition, not surprise. Purpose. Beside the dance floor, one of Preston's friends tried forcing a nervous laugh. Chloe, did you hire military entertainment or something?" Nobody answered him, because suddenly everyone understood these men weren't there to perform. The room had changed. You could feel it physically. All evening, the ballroom operated under invisible social rules. Wealth mattered, status mattered, appearances mattered. Now none of that seemed important anymore. The billionaires, the politicians, the old money families, every single one of them had instinctively gone quiet the moment real authority entered the room. Marcus started walking forward. The 19 other SEALs moved with him immediately in perfect formation. Not rushed, not dramatic, measured. Their polished shoes struck the hardwood floor in synchronized rhythm that echoed through the ballroom louder than the band ever had. One step. Then another. The guests parted automatically without being asked. That part always fascinated me about military presence. Real du command, dara's explanation. Human beings recognize it instinctively. As the formation moved deeper into the ballroom, I noticed something else. None of them looked at the chandeliers, or the decorations, or the wealthy guests staring at them. They weren't impressed by any of it, because men who've spent years walking through active combat zones usually stop caring about seating charts and imported flowers. Marcus kept his eyes forward the entire time, straight toward table 18. straight toward me, and sitting there beside the kitchen doors while 300 stunned guests watched 20 Navy SEALs cross the ballroom in complete silence, I realized something important. The real world had finally arrived at the Rosewood Country Club, and it did not care about the dress code. I stayed seated because standing too early would have turned the moment into theater. And whatever was happening right now clearly wasn't theater. The 20 SEALs continued moving through the ballroom in perfect silence while every guest instinctively stepped out of their path. Women in designer gowns clutched champagne glasses against their chests. Men who spent their lives controlling boardrooms suddenly looked unsure where to place their hands. The sound of polished shoes striking hardwood echoed through the country club with mechanical precision. Steady, measured, final. At the front of the room, my mother recovered first. Of course she did. Evelyn Sterling had spent 40 years surviving awkward social situations through sheer force of controlled smiling. She moved quickly toward Marcus Thorne with the expression wealthy women use when trying to intercept problems before they become visible. "Excuse me," she said politely, stepping into his path. "I think there's been some confusion." Marcus didn't even slow down. Not rude, honestly, that was the unsettling part. He simply shifted half a step sideways and continued walking like human obstacles weren't operationally relevant. My mother froze in place. Ignored. Completely. I honestly don't think that had ever happened to her before. A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable looks while Marcus and the SEALs kept moving deeper into the ballroom, straight toward me. At the head table, Chloe's face had gone pale beneath the makeup. Preston looked caught somewhere between annoyed and nervous, like he couldn't decide whether this situation threatened his ego or his insurance premiums. One of the investors near the bar whispered, "What the hell is this about?" Nobody answered him. Because suddenly the entire room understood something important. These men were not here for Chloe. They weren't here for Preston. And they definitely weren't here for the Vanderbilts. The formation moved past the dance floor, past the champagne tower, past the enormous floral display worth more than most Americans' rent payments. Not one of them looked around. That detail stayed with me later. 300 wealthy guests, politicians, CEOs, socialites, old money, new money, none of it impressed them. Because men who've spent years kicking doors in hostile territory usually stop getting emotionally affected by country clubs. Marcus finally stopped 3 feet from table 18. The other 19 SEALs halted instantly beside him in flawless alignment, every movement crisp enough to cut glass. I slowly stood from my chair. The room became so quiet I could hear the kitchen staff whispering behind the swinging doors. Marcus looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person. More gray around the temples. Thin scar near his jaw I didn't recognize, but the eyes were the same, sharp, calm, dangerously observant. For one brief second, neither of us spoke. Then Marcus glanced at my table, at the half-empty water glass, at the untouched dessert plate, at the seat positioned beside the kitchen doors, and something in his expression hardened almost invisibly. Not anger, understanding. Behind him, the SEALs remained perfectly still. A younger guest near the dance floor nervously laughed under his breath. I seriously feel like I'm watching a movie right now. No one joined him, because this didn't feel cinematic anymore. It felt real, painfully real. Marcus squared his shoulders slightly, and then it happened. 20 men, who had survived some of the worst places on Earth, straightened their posture in complete unison with decades of ingrained military discipline. Then every right hand rose sharply, a perfect salute, not rushed, not dramatic, precise. The kind of salute reserved for respect that runs deeper than rank. The entire ballroom stopped breathing, no music, no movement, just 20 Navy SEALs standing at full attention in front of the woman everyone else had spent the evening mocking. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly, not because of the attention, because I understood exactly what this meant. Military people don't interrupt civilian weddings for performance art, especially not operators, especially not SEALs. Something behind me clattered loudly in the kitchen. Nobody turned. Every eye in the ballroom stayed locked on the formation. I returned the salute automatically. Years of training took over before emotion could interfere. My hand stayed steady, thank God for that, because internally I suddenly felt exhausted. Not weak, not overwhelmed, just tired in a way that reaches bone level. Marcus held the salute for one extra second before lowering his hand. The others followed immediately. Across the ballroom, I saw Uncle Richard staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. not pity. Recognition. Like he was suddenly realizing huge sections of my life existed completely outside the family narrative. My mother looked stunned, actually stunned. Not socially embarrassed, genuinely disoriented. Because for the first time all evening, the hierarchy inside the ballroom had collapsed. Money stopped mattering, status has stopped mattering, the seating chart stopped mattering, and everybody knew it. A woman near table 6 whispered, "Who is she?" One of the SEALs heard her. He didn't even look in her direction when he answered quietly, "Captain Stoltz and Sterling." No speech, no bragging, just my rank. But the way he said it changed the entire room. Because suddenly, Play's soldier didn't sound funny anymore. Now it sounded ignorant. Preston shifted uncomfortably beside Chloe and attempted a weak smile toward the crowd. "Well," he said awkwardly, "this is definitely unexpected." Nobody laughed, not a single person. The silence after his joke felt brutal. Marcus finally spoke for the first time. "Mom." His voice carried the calm weight of someone used to giving instructions under pressure. "I apologize for the interruption." "You don't need to apologize, Master Chief." A flicker of humor touched the corner of his mouth, still trying to follow protocol. Nice to see some things survive Washington. A few of the SEALs behind him smirked slightly, tiny reaction. Human reaction. And somehow that made the entire moment even heavier. Because these weren't props, they weren't symbols. They were real men who'd spent years in places most people in this ballroom couldn't locate on a map. And every single one of them had walked into this country club tonight for one reason only: respect. I became aware of Chloe staring at me from across the ballroom, like she'd suddenly realized she'd been making jokes about a person she never actually understood. Honestly, that part almost hurt, not because she mocked me, because she truly never bothered learning who I became after leaving home. Marcus glanced once around the ballroom before looking back at me. "We were nearby after transport," he said evenly. "Thought it might be important to pay respects in person." Pay respects. Simple phrase. But I watched the room react to it instantly, because now everybody understood this wasn't about intimidation. It was about honor, and nothing confuses shallow people faster than witnessing genuine respect they can't buy. I lowered my salute slowly, and the room still didn't move. 300 people frozen inside, a silence so complete I could hear the faint hum of the ballroom refrigeration system behind the bar. Nobody knew what social rule applied anymore. That was the problem. Money had rules, country clubs had rules. Military respect operated under an entirely different system, and suddenly everybody in that room realized they didn't understand it. Marcus turned slightly toward the head table while keeping his posture relaxed. Not submissive, not aggressive, just completely certain of himself. The kind of certainty that only comes from surviving things other people can't imagine. My mother straightened instinctively like she was preparing to regain control of the evening. Poor woman had no idea control already left the building 10 minutes ago. Marcus glanced briefly at Chloe and Preston before addressing the room in a calm voice that somehow carried across the entire ballroom without effort. "My apologies again for the interruption," he said. "We won't take much of your evening." Nobody answered, not even the band. One of the violinists still stood frozen with her bow halfway raised. Marcus nodded once toward me. But my men and I felt it was important to personally acknowledge Captain Sarah Sterling while we had the opportunity. I saw Preston attempt a polite smile, the kind executives use during lawsuits. "Well, that's certainly very generous." Marcus ignored him completely, again. Honestly, watching powerful civilians get dismissed by career military operators was becoming one of my favorite parts of the evening. "Our transport rerouted 63 miles tonight," Marcus continued evenly, "because 20 men felt they owed this officer their respect in person." The room stayed silent. A woman near the front slowly lowered her champagne glass. Marcus looked directly toward the head table now. "About 11 months ago, Captain Sterling coordinated emergency extraction intelligence during a compromised operation near Al-Hasaka. Every muscle in my body tightened immediately. "Oh no, Marcus, don't." He kept speaking, calm, measured, absolutely unstoppable. Communications were unstable. Multiple routes collapsed. Air support had limited visibility because of the storm system moving through northern Syria that night. I noticed several guests shifting uncomfortably now, not bored anymore, focused, because the tone changed. This no longer sounded like military politeness. Now it sounded like testimony. Marcus clasped his hands behind his back. "My unit lost primary transport capability at approximately 2307 hours. Enemy movement cut off 2 separate extraction corridors within 16 minutes. The ballroom remained completely motionless. Even the waitstaff stopped walking. Captain Sterling awake for 36 consecutive hours, rerouting intel, coordinating emergency aerial windows, and manually recalculating extraction paths while under active hostile pressure. He paused briefly. Then came the line that hit the room like a freight train. 20 American families still have their sons today because of the glorified paperwork this woman executed under enemy fire. Nobody breathed. Literally nobody. I watched the sentence land across the ballroom table by table like a shockwave. Some guests looked confused, some horrified, some suddenly very interested in avoiding eye contact with me. At the head table, Chloe's entire face drained of color. Not embarrassment anymore, fear, because for the first time all evening, she realized the joke she made wasn't socially rude. It was morally disgusting. Preston stared at Marcus, speechless, with one hand still frozen around his whiskey glass. My mother slowly lifted her fingers to cover her mouth, and her hand was shaking. That part almost broke me more than the speech, because Evelyn Sterling finally looked at me the way mothers are supposed to look at their children. Not as decoration, not as inconvenience, as a human being. Marcus continued calmly. There were operators on that extraction route younger than 21 years old. One of the SEALs behind him shifted his jaw slightly. Tiny movement. Memory. Captain Sterling never lost composure once during the operation, Marcus said. Not while aircraft fuel windows narrowed. Not while incoming coordinates changed. Not while wounded personnel required secondary rerouting. His eyes moved briefly toward me. She brought everyone home. The ballroom stayed dead silent. No phones, no whispers, nothing. And suddenly I became painfully aware of where I was standing, near the kitchen doors, at table 18. The invisible daughter shoved into the corner beside the service hallway, because my uniform ruined the wedding aesthetic. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Instead, I looked down briefly at my hands. Steady, still steady. Across the room, Uncle Richard looked openly emotional now. The older woman from my table, Donna, the purse dessert bandit, quietly wiped one eye with a napkin while staring at me like I'd personally rescued her from a burning building. Honestly, that felt excessive. Marcus finally shifted his attention toward Chloe directly. Not hostile. That was the terrifying part. He sounded respectful. We serve with many officers in our careers, he said evenly. Very few earn this level of loyalty from operators. The sentence hung in the air. Everybody understood what he meant. You cannot fake respect inside special warfare communities. Nobody survives long enough for politics to matter more than competence. A younger hedge fund guy near the dance floor whispered quietly, Jesus Christ. Another guest muttered, and they sat her back there. There it was. The shift. Not admiration, perspective. The room suddenly saw the seating chart differently, saw the speeches differently, saw me differently. All evening, these people assumed I was less important because I didn't match their version of success. Now they looked at me like they'd accidentally insulted a surgeon during open heart surgery. Chloe swallowed hard and attempted a weak smile toward me. It looked painful. Artificial, too late. And honestly, I didn't feel victorious watching her fall apart. That surprised me most. I thought humiliation would feel satisfying. It didn't. Looking at my sister standing there, pale and horrified, I mostly felt tired. Tired because none of this should have required witnesses in dress uniforms. None of this should have required classified operations and surviving war zones for my family to treat me like I mattered. Marcus finally stepped slightly backward. We only came to pay respects, Mom, he said to me quietly. Mom, not Sarah, not joke material, not embarrassing, respect. Simple as that. Around the ballroom, I watched wealthy people suddenly reevaluate themselves in real time, the politicians, the executives, the socialites. All evening, they measured human value through money, status, invitations, and appearances. And now 20 exhausted warriors had accidentally burned that entire system to the ground just by telling the truth. The illusion of superiority inside the Rosewood Country Club collapsed so completely you could almost hear it happen. I stood there for a few seconds after Marcus finished speaking because the room genuinely didn't know what to do next. Nobody moved toward the dance floor. Nobody reached for another drink. Even the staff looked uncomfortable, breaking the silences. The entire ballroom felt different now. Smaller somehow. Like all the expensive decorations suddenly lost confidence in themselves. Marcus gave me a respectful nod and stepped back beside his men, while the guests continued staring at me like they were trying to recalculate the last 3 hours of their lives. Across the room, Chloe's eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Not the soft, bridal tears from earlier when she talked about soulmates and floral arrangements. These came from shock, from shame, from finally realizing she had spent years reducing me into a punchline because she never bothered learning who I actually became after leaving home. For a second, I saw the little girl she used to be. The kid who followed me around the backyard asking if Navy ships had missiles. The teenager who cried in my bedroom after her first breakup while stealing fries off my plate. That version of Chloe existed once. Somewhere along the way, status replaced character. And maybe none of us noticed early enough. My mother slowly approached me from across the ballroom. Not gracefully this time. Evelyn Sterling always moved like she was being photographed. Now she just looked human. Her mascara had started smudging slightly beneath one eye, and she kept twisting her wedding bracelet nervously while walking toward table 18. "Sarah," she said quietly, then stopped, because for perhaps the first time in her life, she genuinely didn't know what words could fix a situation. I looked at her calmly, no anger left. That surprised me too. I thought tonight would end with screaming or crying or 15 years of resentment finally detonating in public. Instead, I mostly felt clear. Clear in the way people sometimes feel after surviving turbulence on a plane. Once the shaking stops, you suddenly realize how tightly you'd been holding on to things. My mother swallowed hard. I didn't know. The sentence hung there, and honestly, I believed her. Not because she cared enough to ask over the years. Because people like my mother never really understood military service beyond holiday commercials and airport reunions. She understood visible achievement, promotions, wealth, social standing. Invisible burdens confused her. Classified work confused her. Silence confused her. "I know," I said gently. That answer hurt her more than yelling would. Behind her, Chloe finally walked toward us slowly, with Preston trailing several steps behind, looking like a man who desperately wished private jets could solve emotional disasters. My sister stopped in front of me. Up close, she looked exhausted. Smaller somehow. "I was joking," she whispered weakly. I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said quietly. "You meant it. That was the problem. People always hide cruelty behind humor once consequences arrive. Just jokes, just teasing, just family. But jokes usually reveal exactly what people believe when they think nobody important is listening." Chloe's face crumpled slightly. "I didn't know all that stuff happened. You didn't ask." Another silence settled between us. Not hostile, just honest. Across this ballroom, guests slowly began looking away from our conversation. Because wealthy people love witnessing emotional collapse right until it starts feeling too real. One of the waiters quietly turned off the spotlight near the cake table. The room dimmed slightly. Marcus remained near the entrance with his men, waiting patiently without interrupting. No pressure, no performance, just presence. And standing there between my family and 20 operators in dress whites, I suddenly realized something important. I no longer needed anything from this room. Not approval, not validation, not understanding. That hunger disappeared somewhere along the way without me noticing. Probably years earlier. Maybe the first time I watched exhausted Marines sleep on concrete floors overseas while still joking with each other the next morning. Maybe during casualty notifications. Maybe during those long classified nights when the only thing holding people together was trust. Real things change your relationship with shallow ones. I looked around the ballroom one last time. At the chandeliers, the imported flowers. The billionaire standing awkwardly beside melting ice sculptures and untouched wedding cake. 3 hours earlier, this room made me feel invisible. Now it just looked tired. A beautiful room full of people trapped inside their own ignorance. And suddenly I felt sorry for them. Not superior, not triumphant, just sad that some people spend their entire lives chasing status without ever understanding respect. They are not the same thing. My mother reached for my arm softly. "Sarah, please don't leave like this." I almost smiled, because she still thought tonight was about leaving, about appearances, about managing fallout. But something much bigger had already happened. I gently buttoned the front of my white dress coat while looking at her. "I'm not leaving upset, Mom." That seemed to confuse her. Then I picked up the small Cartier gift box from the table and handed it to Chloe. Her hands trembled taking it. "I bought this because you said you loved it once," I told her quietly. "Congratulations on your wedding." Fresh tears rolled down her face immediately. And for the first time all evening, nobody in the ballroom was looking at Chloe Sterling Vanderbilt like royalty anymore. They were looking at her like a person, flawed, small, human. I turned toward Marcus. "Thank you for coming, Master Chief." He gave a short nod. "Wouldn't miss it, Mom." One of the younger SEALs near the back cracked a faint grin. "Told you she'd still be classy about it." A few quiet laughs moved through the formation. Human again, not intimidating. Just tired professionals honoring somebody they respected. I started walking toward the front doors of the country club while the entire ballroom watched silently. No dramatic speech, no revenge monologue, no final insult. The polished marble floors reflected soft gold light beneath my shoes as I passed the same tables that ignored me hours earlier. Now nobody could hold eye contact for very long. Outside, the night air hit cool against my skin after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. The diesel engines idled quietly near the circular driveway, while military vehicles waited beneath rows of oak trees wrapped in white wedding lights. For a moment, I stopped at the top of the front steps and looked out into the darkness beyond the country club. Peaceful, open, real. Behind me sat an entire world obsessed with appearances. Ahead of me sat people who understood sacrifice without needing it explained. And standing there under the Carolina night sky, I finally understood something that took me 15 years to learn. Real respect is never begged for at dinner tables. It's earned quietly in the moments nobody sees. Then I walked down the steps toward the waiting vehicles without looking back, straight toward my own true north. I ended up at a small 24-hour diner near the Charleston Marina around 11:40 that night, still wearing my dress whites under an old navy blue windbreaker I kept in the trunk of the rental car. The waitress didn't care about the uniform. That honestly felt refreshing. She called me Han, poured burnt coffee into a thick ceramic mug, and warned me not to order the tuna melt because Larry absolutely screwed something up in the kitchen tonight. That was probably the most sincere interaction I'd had all evening. I sat near the window, watching boats rock gently against the docks, while tourists wandered past bars, pretending they still had energy left after midnight. Somewhere down the street, somebody was badly singing karaoke. Real life had resumed, and for the first time all day, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. People probably expected me to feel victorious after what happened at the wedding. I didn't. I felt lighter. There's a difference. Revenge usually leaves people hungry for another round. But clarity settles something inside you. That night, sitting alone with cold fries and terrible diner coffee, I realized the deepest pain wasn't Chloe's joke or Preston's comment about guarding the buffet line. It was the fact that I spent years trying to earn approval from people who only respected things they could display publicly. Money, titles, status, image. My family understood visible success. They understood expensive weddings and last names and curated appearances. But quiet sacrifice confused them, because sacrifice doesn't photograph well. And if I'm being honest, I helped create that situation. For years, I minimized myself every time I came home. I downplayed deployments, changed subjects during conversations, pretended my work was less serious than it actually was because watching people get uncomfortable became exhausting. I'd say things like, "Oh, it's mostly meetings," or "nothing exciting," because it kept dinner peaceful. A lot of people watching this probably do the exact same thing in their own lives. Maybe not military service. Maybe it's your career, your intelligence, your ambition, your discipline, your recovery after surviving something difficult. You shrink parts of yourself because insecure people treat confidence like arrogance the second you stop apologizing for your own existence. And the dangerous part is how slowly it happens. Nobody wakes up one morning deciding to become smaller. It happens one conversation at a time, one family dinner at a time, one sarcastic comment you laugh off to avoid tension, one moment where you pretend something didn't hurt because you don't want to sound dramatic. Then eventually people stop seeing your value because you trained them not to. That realization hit me harder than anything that happened inside the ballroom. Because every time I minimized myself to protect someone else's ego, I accidentally taught them my accomplishments were negotiable. That's not humility, that's emotional survival. And there's a difference. The waitress came back around midnight carrying a fresh coffee pot. "You military?" she asked casually. "Yeah." She nodded once toward my jacket, my daughter's Air Force. Then she pointed her pen at me. "Don't let people make you feel weird for doing hard things." Simple sentence. But it stayed with me. Because sometimes strangers say exactly what your soul needed to hear after people close to you failed miserably at it. I think one of the biggest lessons I learned from military leadership is that real respect usually arrives quietly. The loudest people in the room are rarely the strongest people in the room. Actually, it's usually the opposite. The people who constantly perform importance are often terrified nobody will value them without the performance. That's why shallow environments become exhausting over time. Everybody's competing to look successful instead of becoming solid human beings. Meanwhile, some of the strongest people I've ever met looked completely ordinary. I knew a Navy corpsman in Jordan who hadn't slept properly in 48 hours and still gave his food away to younger Marines because they were more exhausted than he was. I knew an intelligence analyst who quietly prevented a catastrophic operational mistake and never mentioned it again after the mission ended. No speeches, no social media posts, no need for applause, just competence, integrity, responsibility. That's real character. And once you spend enough time around people like that, it changes the way you see the world permanently. You stop getting overly impressed by luxury watches and loud confidence. You start paying attention to consistency instead. How people treat waiters, how they behave when nobody important is watching, whether they only respect others when there's social value attached to it. Here's my honest advice to anyone listening to this story right now. Pay attention when people become uncomfortable after you grow. That reaction tells you everything. Some people love you as long as you stay smaller than them. Smaller financially, smaller emotionally, smaller professionally, smaller socially. The moment you evolve beyond the version of you that made them comfortable, the sarcasm starts, the dismissive jokes start, the weird little disguised as humor start, because insecure people often experience someone else's growth as personal criticism, and you cannot fix that by shrinking yourself further. Trust me, I tried for years. The hardest truth I learned after leaving that wedding is this: some people will never fully respect you until the world validates you loudly enough. That ignoring your value becomes impossible. That's sad, but it's real. And once you accept it, you stop wasting emotional energy begging for understanding from people committed to misunderstanding you. Around 12:27 in the morning, I finally paid my check and walked back outside toward the marina. The air smelled like saltwater and diesel fuel from the boats. Quiet, cool, peaceful. And standing there under those dock lights, I realized something I wish I understood years earlier. You do not owe anyone the reduction of yourself just to remain lovable. Not your family, not your friends, not your workplace, nobody. Because the right people will never require you to become smaller in order to feel comfortable standing beside you. I drove back toward Virginia the next morning with terrible gas station coffee and about 4 hours of sleep running through my bloodstream like expired medication. Around Fayetteville, I stopped at a red light behind an old pickup truck covered in faded Marine Corps stickers and one crooked fishing decal that said "Life is Wort, buy the boat." Honestly, that man probably understood happiness better than half the people at the Rosewood Country Club. The wedding stayed in my head during most of the drive. Not the humiliation part anymore. The contrast. That's what bothered me. Because if you really think about it, that ballroom was full of successful people by American standards. Investors, attorneys, executives, politicians, families worth more money than entire neighborhoods. And yet some of those same people sat there laughing while another human being got publicly diminished for entertainment. That realization changed something for me permanently. We spend so much time in this country confusing status with character. They are not remotely the same thing. A person can own 3 houses and still fail basic decency. A person can wear a Rolex and still behave like a coward when somebody weaker gets humiliated in front of them. And a person can sit at table 18 beside the kitchen doors while carrying responsibilities most people in the room would emotionally collapse under within 20 minutes. That's the part I wish more people understood. Visible comfort tells you almost nothing about internal strength. Some of the strongest people I've ever met would never impress socialites at country clubs. One of the toughest women I know is a single mother in Norfolk who works double shifts at a trauma center while raising 2 boys alone after her husband died from cancer at 38. Nobody applauds when she walks into restaurants. Nobody invites her to luxury weddings. But I watched her hold herself together while making impossible decisions for her children with more courage than most executives bring to quarterly meetings. I knew another guy in Coronado who got mocked by his cousins for joining the military instead of becoming a corporate lawyer like the rest of the family. They treated him like he chose the less successful path. 3 deployments later, he was still the first person everybody called during family emergencies because, deep down, they trusted him more than the polished relatives with expensive suits. That happens a lot in life. People misjudge value because modern culture trains us to worship presentation, followers, money, luxury, connections, the appearance of importance. But pressure reveals character faster than appearances ever will. That's why military environments change your perspective permanently. In high-pressure situations, image becomes useless very quickly. Nobody cares how impressive somebody sounded at dinner parties once things become difficult. Nobody cares where you vacationed. Nobody cares about your golf membership. People care whether you stay calm, whether you tell the truth, whether others can depend on you when consequences become real. That's character. And honestly, I think many people listening to this story already carry more character than they give themselves credit for. Some of you are leading households under financial pressure while still protecting your children emotionally every day. Some of you are quietly supporting aging parents while your siblings disappear until holidays. Some of you are building businesses, surviving illness, recovering from grief, working exhausting jobs, or rebuilding yourselves after life punched holes straight through your confidence. That counts. Leadership doesn't always look dramatic. Most real leadership happens quietly. Leadership is absorbing pressure without spreading panic to everybody else. Leadership is staying responsible even when nobody rewards you for it. Leadership is making difficult decisions while still protecting other people from unnecessary fear. And here's something else I learned after years around military operators. The strongest people are usually the least interested in proving they're strong. That's why Marcus and those SEALs changed the room without raising their voices. They didn't need intimidation. Their discipline spoke before they did. Meanwhile, insecure people often perform importance constantly because their terrified silence will expose how fragile they actually are. Once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. You see it in workplaces, families, friend groups, social media. The loudest people in the room are often trying hardest to convince themselves they matter. That's why I want to give one piece of practical advice to anyone watching this who feels underestimated by people around them. Stop using shallow people as mirrors. Seriously. If someone only respects wealth, appearances, or social status, then their opinion of your value is already corrupted before the conversation even begins. You will exhaust yourself trying to earn fair judgment from people emotionally incapable of giving it. And eventually, you realize something freeing. Not everybody deserves equal access to your self-worth. That doesn't mean becoming arrogant. It means becoming selective about whose opinions actually qualify to shape your identity. At a gas station outside Petersburg later that afternoon, I watched a tired construction worker buy chocolate milk and 2 hot dogs while still taking time to hold the door open for an elderly woman struggling with a walker. Nobody applauded him. Nobody posted inspirational quotes about it online. But honestly, that man displayed more character in 15 seconds than some people display across entire careers. That's the stuff that matters. Not curated perfection, not status, not who got seated near the dance floor. Character reveals itself through responsibility, consistency, humility, and how people treat others when there's absolutely nothing socially profitable to gain from it. And once you truly understand that difference, you stop being intimidated by shiny people, because shiny and solid are not the same thing. About 3 weeks after the wedding, Chloe called me at 9:18 on a Tuesday night while I was sitting inside my apartment folding laundry and watching a documentary about deep-sea fishing disasters, which honestly felt less emotionally stressful than my family. I stared at the phone for a full 10 seconds before answering because I genuinely didn't know which version of my sister I was about to get. The defensive version, the crying version, the let's move on version people use when they want forgiveness without accountability. Instead, she sounded tired, really tired. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey," then silence, not hostile silence. Just 2 people standing awkwardly in the ruins of a relationship neither of them fully understood anymore. Finally, Chloe exhaled softly. "I can't stop thinking about that night." I folded another t-shirt carefully before answering. "Yeah, me neither." Another pause. Then she asked the question I think she'd been avoiding her entire life. Why didn't you ever tell us any of that stuff? I leaned back against the couch and looked around my apartment. Small place. Clean, quiet, no chandeliers, no country club guests, no performance, just real life. And honestly, I realized I liked my real life more than the world I came from. I tried, I said finally. You guys just never really wanted to hear it. That sounds harsh. But sometimes maturity means describing reality without decorating it. Started crying again, not dramatically, not manipulatively, just the exhausted kind of crying that happens when somebody finally sees themselves clearly and doesn't love what they found. I feel horrible, she whispered, and for a moment, I thought I'd finally feel satisfaction hearing that. I didn't. That's something nobody tells you about emotional growth. Once you genuinely outgrow the need for revenge, other people's guilt stops feeling rewarding. Because revenge still keeps you emotionally attached to the wound. Peace doesn't. I told Chloe something that night I wish more people understood earlier in life. You don't need to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself, I said. But you do need to become different from the person who thought humiliating someone was funny. Silence again. Then, a small broken laugh. Jesus, you always sound like a Navy recruiting commercial. That's because therapy is expensive. That got a real laugh out of her. Tiny moment. Human moment. And honestly, I think that conversation mattered more than the salute at the wedding. Because the salute exposed the truth publicly. But this was the first honest conversation my sister and I had in years. No audience, no performance, no status games, just honesty. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about how many people spend years emotionally starving because they keep begging for respect from people committed to misunderstanding them. Family, partners, bosses, friends. You explain yourself over and over, hoping eventually the other person will suddenly become emotionally mature enough to value you correctly. Sometimes that happens. A lot of times it doesn't. That's the hard truth. Some people only recognize your worth after the world validates it loudly enough that ignoring it becomes socially impossible. And if you build your self-worth entirely around finally earning their approval, you will stay emotionally trapped forever. That's why the most important moment of that wedding wasn't the salute. It wasn't Marcus speaking. It wasn't the room going silent. The most important moment happened quietly inside me when I realized I no longer needed my family's approval to feel complete. That realization changes everything, because once you stop begging people to see your value, you become much harder to control emotionally. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop performing exhaustion just to prove you're struggling enough to deserve empathy. You stop apologizing for discipline, ambition, intelligence, or growth. And maybe most importantly, you stop chasing relationships where respect always feels conditional. I know some people listening to this story probably feel invisible inside their own families right now. And I want to say something carefully because I don't believe in fake motivational nonsense. It genuinely hurts when strangers treat you with more dignity than relatives do. That pain is real, especially when you spent years loving people who only appreciated convenient versions of you. But here's what I learned. You cannot force people to emotionally mature fast enough to appreciate your value correctly. Some people are deeply committed to seeing you through an outdated lens, because accepting your growth would force them to confront their own limitations. That's not your responsibility to fix. Forgiveness helped me understand that too. And before people misunderstand me, forgiveness does not mean pretending someone did nothing wrong. It doesn't mean excusing cruelty. It doesn't mean reopening doors that should stay closed. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to carry bitterness long enough for it to poison your future. That's all. Chloe may replay that wedding in her head for the rest of her life. My mother probably will too. But I refuse to let one night become the emotional center of my entire existence. Life is bigger than one painful room. That matters. A few nights ago, I got a handwritten thank you card from one of the younger SEALs who showed up at the wedding. He wrote exactly 2 sentences inside. Thank you for always bringing people home. Hope you know we'd follow you anywhere. That card meant more to me than every fake compliment spoken inside the Rosewood Country Club combined. Because respect earned through integrity lasts longer than admiration earned through image. Always. So if you take anything away from this story, let it be this. Build a life rooted in character instead of appearances. Care more about integrity than popularity. More about consistency than performance. more about purpose than status. Because careers change, money changes, social circles change. But character follows you everywhere you go. And at the end of your life, you probably won't regret failing to impress enough strangers at expensive dinner parties. You'll regret abandoning yourself just to stay accepted in rooms that never deserved you to begin with. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever felt underestimated, invisible, or quietly disrespected, despite everything you carry every single day, subscribe to the channel. Because these stories were never really about revenge. They're about dignity and learning your worth before the world finally catches up.